Okay. All right, John, I think we're ready.
Okay.
Is the volume for John okay? Can everybody hear John?
If you can't hear me, yell at me or something. I'm half deaf, so I might not hear you, so you gotta yell loud. But anyway.
Same here.
Throw something.
Throw something works. Thanks for inviting me back. I always enjoyed talking here. It's a great space, and I'm impressed with the young historical society that is so active and has gotten so much done, and it's continuing to get things done. It's a great example. I've gone to a lot of local area historical societies, and you guys are really doing top notch. As some of you know who've heard me before, I'm a bit of a railroad nut, so a lot of times I talk about railroad things. I do talk about other things occasionally. But tonight we're going to talk about what's my favorite railroad, a small line that in actuality only ran 37 miles plus an 8-mile sideline. But it had grander hopes, and we're going to talk about that because some of those hopes involve this area. So this was almost your local railroad. The short but eventful life of the Delaware and Eastern, later the Delaware and Northern, from 1905 to 1942. I'm going to give some basic history about the beginning of the railroad. It's going to be a little disjointed because we go off in a number of tangents. But we're going to start with the basic history that in around 1904, a Wall Street banker named Frederick Searing came up with the idea, quote unquote, of creating a railroad from East Branch on the Delaware River near Hancock to Arkville. What that railroad would do would join up the O&W Railroad that ran along the Delaware with the Ulster and Delaware Railroad that came up from Kingston to Arkville, then Oneonta. That is the plan they announced. There's some folk thinking that he and his other financial backers all along had wider ambitions, but what they announced was this plan to construct this short railroad connecting two larger railroads. He did not make the mistake that a number of other railroads had made, or maybe because they had made that mistake, he couldn't do it. Back in the 19th century, a number of railroads got their funding largely from communities. The community wanted a railroad to come to their town, so they would invest in the bonds or the stocks. And several Catskill area communities got really badly burned, where people invested, or the town invested a lot of money, then they never got a railroad, and they were paying these, worthless bonds for 60 years. So when Searing came up with this idea, he sought other, commercial financing. He did not try to get money out of the towns, which was a smart move, or maybe he had no choice. Another version of the story is that a man named R.B. Williams, who worked for the O&W, had already had this same idea. But somehow Williams and Searing and some of the other financial people all got it together. The cute story is that Searing and some of his friends in 1904 took the train, the O&W, to East Branch, and then had a really, really rough horse and wagon ride to where they were going somewhere between Downsville and Andes. And his friends joked with him, "Oh, you should make a railroad so we could have an easier ride." And supposedly this gave him the idea. Again, a number of different versions of this story. In any event, they obtained enough financing that they started the initial work. Already I'm going to sidetrack. What they announced is this 37-mile line plus the 8-mile extension. Supposedly, all along, both Williams and Searing had much bigger plans in mind, but knew that if they like tipped their hat too early, it would cause problems. So they didn't initially announce their grander plans. So in 1904, they start building this planning this 37-mile railroad. 1905, the actual work starts. The first pipe for the D&E was driven September 14th. And here you see the entrance of the first D&E train into Arena, and that would have been November. So, very shortly later, they already had some trackage and trains running. What they did was they ended up building from both ends, planning to meet in the middle. So they started work from Arkville, working along, now this is, mind you, before the Pavacton Reservoir, so you just have the river, the east branch of the Delaware, flowing from Arkville to Margaretville, then Arena, Union Grove, Shavertown, Pavacton, Downsville, Corbett, and a whole bunch of other communities. We'll talk about them later. So construction started from both ends, but the first trains running for a very small part were from Arkville to Margaretville to Arena. They complete the whole 37-mile main line in 1906, and there's a huge celebration in Downsville. This is an era, remember, this is before hardly anybody had cars. Unless you wanted a really rough and slow horse and wagon ride, the train was what brought items that communities needed in and brought their produce out. So that having this train meant that anything that was created in this valley, such as there's a lot of milk, there's also acid from wood factories, and there's also bluestone. And having the train able to transport these commodities meant that they didn't have, long and very difficult and sometimes virtually impossible, like to move heavy stone by horse and wagon is really bad. To move it on a train is a lot easier. So there was a big celebration when the main line was finished. So that was November of 1906. And they're working on the extension that went from Union Grove to Andes, a little sideline up to Andes. And this is a trestle that was built on that line. And try to remember this image of the trestle, because I'll be referring back to that later. But remember that there was this big trestle. There are actually two trestles initially on that Andes spur. So they had a really nice station in Andes. This is the station there. And they had a celebration in Andes. This would have been in March of 1907, celebrating the first train. But now here's a sort of a harbinger of things to come. Within a couple of days, they could no longer run trains on the Andes branch. There was rock slides closed off the track. Maybe because there were some problems or some less than optimal construction techniques, let's put it that way, raw materials. This line was continually plagued with accidents, derailments. In April of 1908, there's a derailment at Long Flat. That would be just before you get to East Branch. And then, much more serious, there was a wreck in May of 1908. The engine ended up in the river, in the East Branch of the Delaware. Fortunately, no one was killed, but the engineer was literally pinned under the engine in the water for 5 hours. Other people, other members of the train crew, literally took turns holding his head up. So his head was above water until they could get the equipment there to, lift it and get him out of there. So he survived, but it was a rough one. So this is 1908. Now we're going to backtrack a little. Let's with the pointer. I'm going to show you. So
on the wall.
Yes.
Huh.
With the cat.
It's not going on the screen. Okay.
It's above and below.
Yeah, it's going above and below, but for some reason it won't reflect that. Look to the left, sort of 2/3 of the way down on the left, you'll see East Branch. So that's the far end of what they built. And then sort of right in the middle, you see the spur to Andes, and just below that, you'll see Arkville. So that's actually all that they built. But they had grander plans, as I said, from the beginning, although they didn't announce them at first. But by 1906, they're willing to go public with these grander plans, which was to run all the way from the coal fields in Pennsylvania near Scranton up to Schenectady. And what this would do would bring the coal that was needed in the Albany area and also into New England. They felt that they offered a better route than the existing means, which were either coming by the D&H or by the O&W, and a little bit on the U&D, not so much the U&D. But the O&W and D&H had a lot of coal business that they brought to New England and to upstate New York. So the real plan for this railroad was that if they could, build out from their 37-mile beginning to reach the coal fields in Pennsylvania and reach up to Schenectady, that they could make a lot of money and undercut the other railroads because they had a more direct route and a route that was less steep. Railroads, the steepness of the terrain for the tracks is a big deal because it costs so much for an engine to climb, and a lot of times, you'll see later, they have to engineer around it sometimes, where they just can't do a steeper grade. Another example would be in High Mountain. There's a horseshoe curve just to get up from Pine Hill to High Mountain. They had to engineer basically a double curve so that it wasn't too steep. So their plans, which they finally announced in 1906, to go from the coal fields in Pennsylvania to Schenectady, and the local area here, you can see on this slide, the dark dotted line was the proposed line. Where it goes off to the left would be up toward Grand Gorge. Then it's going to come down to Prattsville and do a U-turn. And the reason they did that was because the terrain wasn't so steep, that if they tried to go from Grand Gorge directly over the hill where Route 30 goes now, that was too steep. It was actually better to do this many miles detour on more level ground, go down to Prattsville, then go up the Schoharie Valley, which is, as you can see here, under the reservoir now, get to Gilboa, and then continue up to Breakabeen, Middleburg, Schoharie, and eventually reach Schenectady. So they announced that this was what they were hoping to do in 1906, and there's an article from the Gilboa Monitor, that would be June of 1906, where they announced their plans, and that they had the financing. And there's a lot of funny business with a lot of railroad construction, that they create all kinds of different companies. They'll say that they're working under or with the Delaware and Eastern Railroad, but they would create the Schenectady Southwestern Railroad Company, which is listed here. And then, actually this is from the same paper, another take on that. Then, by 1907, they had made an agreement to join all these different entities together, basically, under the Delaware and Eastern. And they had a lease for 999 years to connect with the coal fields. A little optimistic here. But as expected, the other railroads fought them. The D&H and the O&W basically went to the court saying, you can't do this. And it took until 1908 for the courts to finally rule in favor of the D&E, that they could, in fact, build what they had been proposing. So it took 2 years of sorting it out in the courts, which of course delayed the project and upped the legal fees. So as soon as they had that final court victory, they send their surveying crew out. It's hard to read from the distance, but in the lower right, this is a photograph from Breakabeam. So they had their surveying crew going up and down this proposed line, laying out where the line would run and figuring out what work had to be done to, in some places level the ground, other places do some blasting, build a trestle, build a bridge, whatever. So but they had their crew out there by 1908, as soon as they won that court case. And again, the big thing to think here is that they're really up. Your local railroad here, the nearest station, would have been South Gilboa on the Ulster and Delaware, or the other end of the Ulster Delaware you would have gotten to Hunter. So to have a railroad coming right through this area would have made a big difference for Gilboa, Conesville, Breakabeam, all these communities in this area. This is October 1909, an article from the Gilboa Monitor, and it's announcing that they were bringing in the heavy equipment to begin the actual construction work. They had completed their surveying, knew what they needed to do, and were bringing in the machinery and the workers to do it. And that's from Gilboa Monitor in 1909, October. In January 1910, there's just an article in the Catskill Mountain News, railroad work hindered by snow. They're trying to keep things going, but that was another one of their problems that they faced out of their hands. Mother Nature dealt them a particularly difficult winter that year and really caused a problem with construction. But that really was the lesser of the problems, because very quickly there were financial problems. The D&E had raised the funding or worked out funding for this extension and had begun work. They had contracts with all these contractors, and then either some of the contractors or subcontractors didn't pay their workers, but it turned out that there was a much bigger problem afoot because the D&E itself was on some shaky financial ground. Searing's Bank had arranged sales of a lot of bonds in Europe, and there was something, and I've done a lot of reading on it, I still don't fully understand it, where the salesman either dumped bonds or did something that threw them for a loop, then turned around and claimed that he was owed a huge commission. So there was a lot of, financial lawsuits going back and forth over this. And this is right when they're trying to work on this construction. And so that, as one subcontractor is knocked out, then maybe somebody else will try to take it over. And other people are saying, it's amazing to read these articles, because I scanned through the Gilboa Monitor that's available online, and you read a whole series of articles over these months, and each one is optimistic. Oh, there's this small glitch, but we expect that it's going to be overcome and construction will resume. Then there's another glitch, and then there's another glitch. But each time the article's saying, we expect and we hope that, things will, work out and we'll get our railroad. Wasn't going to happen. So, by March, things are worse. The Searing's Bank has actually gone under. They're setting up receivership basically to keep the line running, but run by somebody else. And very quickly it becomes apparent that any new people aren't going to try this further construction and extension. So what happens is by 1911, the railroad is reorganized as the Delaware and Northern. And that's what it remains till the end of its days in 1942. And their sole purpose was keeping those 37 miles of track between Arkville and East Branch running, and initially that 8-mile spur to Andes. So here's a timetable from the new railroad, the Delaware and Northern. I have a lot of material up here for folks to look at afterwards. And I can talk your ear off all night about this railroad, so be prepared. I'm trying to cut it short here. And I'll also talk about the different books and things that are available. And I have a handout over there. This is a listing of the different books and material available. So anybody who is interested can take that home and, do some more reading. So now I'm going to quickly go through the 37-mile ride from Arkville to East Branch. Now that they've given up their grander plans that included Schoharie County and are just this 37 miles plus 8 in Delaware County, ran from Arkville to East Branch. And we're actually going to backtrack a little because most of these cards are earlier, so they'd be from that initial D&E phase, but they were the same, places that were served by the DNN afterwards. So you start at Arkville, where the U&D curves to go up to Roxbury and then Grand Gorge. So they stayed straight and went from Arkville, basically along what is today's Route 28 to Margaretville. And here's a great view. This covered bridge is basically where the bridge in Margaretville now that brings you to Freshtown. So right on 28, as you're coming into Margaretville, you would have seen that bridge. And then the Margaretville station was just past the bridge. We'll get back to that later with one of the side stories. Here's from the opposite direction, so you'd be looking at that bridge. So in 1909, they had a little bit of a stampede. Someone was trying to herd cattle, and they were crossing that covered bridge, and then planning, I guess, to get them to Arkville. And one of the bulls had a different idea. The bull broke off and went tearing up the tracks in the other direction towards the station in Margaretville. And, wrecking total havoc. I mean, to get out of its way, people climbed up on things and stuff. So it took a few hours, but they finally got the bull back in the proper direction. But that was big news. That was a big article in the Catskill Mountain News. So here's another view of that station in Margaretville. Again, so you'd be looking basically from that bridge, looking up at the station. And Margaretville again. And then there was a small station in Dunraven, right where the police barracks are today, where 30 turns to go along the reservoir today. There was a small station up there. Then next you had Arena, which today is under the Paxton Reservoir. Last fall, when it was so dry, you could actually walk out onto the streets of Old Arena. It was the reservoir was that low. It was amazing. But in higher water, Arena, the site of Arena is totally underwater. Closer look at the depot. Then next you had Union Grove. And the branch line that went up to Andes broke off from Union Grove and went up to Trumperskill to Andes. So here's another old, later picture as it's more run down. Then your station would be Papacton. One of the things that the D&E did was they built and ran their own dairies. Some of the other railroads, had arrangements with local dairies or whatever, but they saw there was money to be made in having their own dairy. So here, in this case, Borden's is running this one, but they had constructed or worked out the details for a number of dairies because that's one of the prime products that benefited from the rail travel, that the trains could get that fresh milk to New York City very, very quickly in, time to sell it before it's spoiled. Then you have the station at Downsville. This station still stands. I think it's a private home now, but it still does stand. And another view of Downsville. This would be next town down at Corbett. Corbett was interesting because you can see the tracks in the building here, where if you see my arrow, that building still stands. So you can see this. Corbett was big in the acid factory business. There was a huge acid factory there. Before they worked out chemical ways to do it, most acid was made, is called wood acid, and took a huge amount of wood to produce. So in Corbett, the upper part of this diagram will show you, here's the line of the train itself, but all of this is private tracks of the acid factory, so that they could get their acid to the train. Where you see the river here, that's where that one-lane bridge is now. Anybody who goes down that way, there's a great old, from like the 1920s bridge there now. But even as early as the early 1900s, the acid factory was really thriving there. This would be one of the small engines that the acid factory used for its own trackage. And you can see the east branch of the Delaware. This is before the reservoir, and this is actually below the reservoir anyhow, but how winding it is. But because railroads really need that level terrain, they would rather follow the winding river where it was flat than try to climb over hills. So they follow the river, basically. And then your next station would be Shinhopple. I did a version of this talk at there's a small community center in Shinhopple. I did a version last year, so that was cool to actually be showing people their local railroad again. And then this would be just before East Branch, where the line ended and it met the O&W. So this would be the station at East Branch. They constructed, some stations would have a turntable like at, I think they had at Arkville. At East Branch they worked a Y. It's a convoluted thing where the train basically goes onto a side track and then backs up and around. So a real brief look at the equipment of the D&E. So here's the Delaware Northern, so that's going to be later, but still steam, obviously. The Brill car. This was a lifesaver for the Delaware Northern. They weren't making that much money. They were struggling along. They did okay, actually, in receivership just before and during World War I. Then briefly in World War I, the feds took over all railroads, and then afterwards they were on pretty shaky ground again. Reorganized multiple times. Somebody came up with this brilliant idea that instead of running a huge train, an engine, a coal car, the post office car, a passenger car, and a freight car, which cost a lot of money, they could, for the amount of passengers and freight that they carried and the mail, they could get it all into one car. They bought this, which is sort of like a version of a trolley car. It's gasoline powered, and you had everything in one car. You had, the engineer in the front, obviously, driving. You had a section for the post office. You had passenger seats for the limited number of passengers they had, and there was room for freight. And if for some reason you had a huge freight load, then they could, break out one of the engines and run it. But for day-to-day operations, this thing saved them a ton of money. What they got for the mail contract, just for transporting the mail on this line, paid for the operation of the Brill car. So whatever they took in for passengers or other freight was all bonus. So this was a real lifesaver. And they called it the Red Heifer. It was painted this really funny kind of maroonish shade. And the way it went, because the tracks were so wobbly, it literally went, people say, galumphing down the tracks. So that's the Brill car, which helped them a great deal. This would have been one of the older cars that, once the Brill car is in operation, this pretty much sat on the siding. They had it if they needed it, but it didn't get used much. So it's the Railway Post Office in Delaware and Northern. And the caboose. This is a view of the Brill car, and to the upper left of the Brill car you'll see some weird structures. Those are actually test borings for the reservoir. New York City early on knew that they needed another reservoir after the Ashokan and after the Gilboa. They needed more. And in 1929, a man named Sam Rossoff, who had made a lot of money on subways in New York, bought the Delaware and Northern. And his thinking was, he knew that New York City was planning this other reservoir. He figured he would make money, bring in the supplies for the reservoir, and then they would want his land, because the reservoir would be taken for the reservoir. He'd make money from that, and could relocate the line higher up the way that the Ulster and Delaware did at Ashokan. The rail trail that you walk today is the relocated line. The original line is under the Ashokan Reservoir today. So anyhow, so you see the test borings here. This would have been in the 1930s. The Brill car riding by thinking, oh, this will be great. This will, solve our money problems. Unfortunately, the Depression and then World War II intervened, and Rossoff just couldn't keep holding on. One of the things actually that the Brill car was known for was it transported students from those small communities, from Arena, from Shavertown, up to the school in Margaretville. And he basically said he'd take the kids for free because he really, wanted these kids to get an education. One of the nice things when I did a much earlier version of this presentation, well, actually I'll tell it at the end when I get there. So, locomotive says goodbye, the road ends operation, and this would have been October 1942. The last train ran on October 17th, but in true Delaware and Northern fashion, they forgot a freight car. So later on, they had to send the Brill car back to tow the freight car out, and then the Brill car ran out of gas. This is how... I just want to say I owe much to several individuals who have taught me much about railroading in the Catskills: John Hamm, Michael Kudish, and John LeBar. So, in an earlier version I did of this talk, I ended with this, that the line ceased its operation on October 17th, the last run. And a voice from the audience called out, "I was on that train." I had somebody attending my talk who, as a kid, rode that last train. So that was living history. That was great. And then I always like to close by acknowledging great debt I owe 3 departed Catskills historians. I learned so much from Justine Hummel, Lonnie Gale, and Tim Mallory. I wish there had been time to learn more. Now that's the end of the PowerPoint, but I'm going to talk a couple of minutes about the stuff here and then invite people to come up and take a look. As I said, I have a handout with a lot of these references. You've probably heard me talk about this before, and I know you've had Mike Kudish talk for you. This is the best book on railroading in the Catskills, because Mike Kudish walked like every inch of the old tracks and has mapped out to the 10th or even 100th of a mile where the old water tower stood and where there was a culvert. This is a phenomenal book for exploring the rail history. John Hamm does a lot of great railroad books. This is his book on the Delaware and Northern. His strength is always the photographs. He just has phenomenal photographs and good quality reproductions of them. Once he gave a talk in Fleischman's for us, and we showed, I had this really crummy, grainy photograph, and then he showed how, after he cleaned it up, it looked like $1 million. So his photos are always great. The classic on the D&E is, and D&N would be The Damn Nuisance by Harry Archer. This was the first one to come out. It came out, I think, 1971. So there were still people alive then who had worked and remembered the railroad. So he did a lot of research. He goes into a lot of the financial details. Some of them I glossed over here. He'll go into greater detail on. This is really the classic. It is hard to find. He printed it himself, and there weren't that many. I've seen it go on eBay for in the hundreds. So it's a hard one to get. Later on, a woman named Gertrude Fitz-Horton did a more personal history of the line. It's much more like anecdotes and fun happenings along the line. Her father had worked for the railroad for many years, so she knew a lot about it too. But it's a more personal, I want to say down home. It's fun. Archer is interesting and great, but you don't laugh so much in his book. You laugh in the Fitz-Horton. So the Ulster and Delaware Railroad Historical Society, which I don't think is too active at this point, years ago used to do field trips, and they had done a lot of research. So for example, I showed that slide. Here's that full map where they took the topo map, today's topo map, and then created on it showing you where that proposed line here went. So here would be Conesville. Here would be West Conesville, and then Gilboa up here. But just showing you that they seriously were doing the work, and they had the equipment here, but unfortunately the thing with the money ran out. And I don't know how many of you got the Tri-County. I had an article about the D&E, D&N in here, and this is available in Gilboa. So, any questions, or people are welcome to come up and look at stuff?
Now, what rail company built the bridge in Praxville for the train? Was it crossing by Johnson Hollow?
Right. That was part of this process where they started that construction. So that would have been the D&E. I'm glad you mentioned that. I forgot to mention that that's one of the remaining. Unfortunately, the bridge itself is gone, but you can still see some of the bridge work. Yeah. Yeah.
I
think they took it out.
I know they were talking about it.
Yeah, I
think it's out now.
I think it is out, but you can see that you can see where it was. That was part of this process when they were trying to, because it was a weird loop to avoid that steep climb. They were going to go all the way from Grand Gorge down to Prattsville and then back up, which under the reservoir now, back up to Gilboa rather than just go over. But because of the steepness and the trains don't like steep, it was better to go that detour down and around. But that's one of the few places where you can see, remnants of the line.
I was curious to know the land that they built it on. I know you mentioned one gentleman that had land that he sold, but was the primary portion of the land, was it state land, or was it purchased by eminent domain? How did they get all of the land?
I haven't gone into enough detail on that. Most of the time, what the railroads would do would buy a lease, basically. We're leasing 30 feet of your land for 100 years or whatever. And so, for example, what was the Ulster and Delaware running up from Kingston, in Ulster County, the county owns that right of way now. Here in Delaware County, like where the rail trail is near Roxbury going up to Bloomville, the county owns that.
Yeah. So I know when they built the railroad in Westchester, you could see in the archives like all the deeds of all the people along the route that all sold.
Right,
and that
right.
was 1851 when they started that eminent domain.
Yeah. I don't think this line did much in the way of eminent domain. They would be more, and most people wanted the railroad. There are horror stories of somebody who says, I'm going to, hold up the top dollar from the railroad.
Yeah.
And then the railroad would say, okay, heck with you, we're going around this other way.
Yeah, yeah.
That happened a lot. So Most people, though, figured the railroad's gonna bring their community prosperity, so they were happy, to sell at a reasonable price.
Or
I
they
know
got
it's not in the
money every
Catskills,
year
but I'm
for like
curious.
the lease.
Right, if they had a lease, that
Right.
would have been,
Yeah.
you're getting X amount every year, yeah.
Sure. Have you ever seen over in Milford near, it's, Cooperstown Junction, that railroad line there? Wondering if you know anything about that? Because that's defunct now, that there's no trains going on there.
Right, that's another, and that's the interesting thing, you gotta realize back then there were all these tiny companies.
Yeah.
So this line that I'm talking about was 37 miles.
Yeah,
That's not that short, believe it or not. We think of, lines being transcontinental. Today Amtrak
Sure.
takes you from Boston to LA.
yeah,
But back then, there would be multiple, railroads in one area. And in fact, I think, was it last year I did the unusual railroad history one? There was this 5-mile line up from Schoharie to Schoharie Junction. Then there was a separate 5-mile line from Schoharie to Middleburg. One of the interesting things as I was doing the research on this talk tonight, I went more into the newspapers about the proposed extension. Previously, when I've talked about the railroad, it was more the general history and not, I'd mentioned this, but not in this detail. But they were actually surveying even alongside the U&D line from coming up through Roxbury, that they were looking at creating a separate line next to it, not just running on the U&D track through that stretch, but creating their own competing stretch. And that's not unusual. If you go up to Haines Falls today, if you walk the rail trail from the depot in Haines Falls out towards Catskill Falls, if you look off to the side, you see another railroad bed like 40 feet away. There were 2 competing railroads that went from North Lake to Haines Falls, literally, a stone's throw apart. So that's not unusual. Each small railroad, had its own idea and thought it could make money.
interesting.
So, and people are welcome to look at items here or any other questions. And again, this is the handout. Anybody who wants to, see what some of the resources are and the names of the books, you don't have to write them down. And thank you for having me here.
Everybody, we have raffle tickets, 50-50, if anybody else wants one, getting ready.